Attending the Sustainability on Assessment Trips webinar. I'm Katrina Myers, a project engineer at EWB USA headquarters. Okay, so to start off, we always like to start any presentation with our mission and vision. So really so that everything comes back to that. So our mission is to support community-driven development programs worldwide by collaborating with local partners to design and implement sustainable engineering projects while creating transformative experiences and responsible leaders. So it's really a twofold mission. The first focused on our community partners, and the second focused on our members and the transformative experiences that they have. Okay, so today the purpose of this presentation is to talk about how working on sustainability early in a project makes our work more successful. The goal is to look at specific tasks to accomplish in the early phases of a project that will set the project up for long-term success. And then next steps, how after you return from your assessment trips, the work on sustainability that continues even remotely. And then at the end, we'll have time for some questions. So the purpose of this presentation, generally our goal is to make sure that chapters are thinking about the long-term impact of their projects from the earliest phase of project development. When you're attuned to what aspects of community structure, local material acquisition, and partner commitment will help a project last, your team will be better equipped to design a project that works for the community and that they will maintain into the future. So this is this presentation really assumes that you have familiarity with the general and technical goals of the assessment, and it focuses solely on incorporating aspects of sustainability into your trip planning. So project team members are encouraged to view technical assessment webinars specific to their projects, as well as health and safety planning. And also, EWB USA will eventually have webinars on general trip advice, but right now we don't. So technical webinars are available on the EWB USA website. Today we will define what we mean by sustainability in the context of EWB. The information presented is intended to provide guidance to chapters about the tasks to accomplish on an assessment trip that will help ensure that the project is sustainable. Chapters should be thinking about what information they will be able to gather to build a project with the best chance of lasting long-term from the onset of their relationship with the community. So this is really focused on that upfront assessment. We'll go over tools you can use to create the foundation of sustainability in your work, including talking points to make sure that you cover with your community partners in community meetings. And at each phase of the project development, your project team should maintain a conscious effort to ensure that this is still the right project for your team and for the community. So this is a continual effort. It's not just up front, but it is especially important at the early phases of the project when much is still unknown or unclear. And we'll also cover some questions that the team can use to self-evaluate if you're still on the right path. Okay, so sustainability, that's a term that is such a catchphrase, such a buzzword, that it's very risky for us to emphasize it without first defining what it is from our organizational perspective, from our mission and vision. So, there's these 4 points to sustainability. So the first one, we always want to make sure that our projects don't harm the environment as a result of our implementation. The second one, we want to design to be socially acceptable and appropriate for all members of the community. Projects that we implement are to be affordable for the community to operate and maintain into the future, so that's the economic side. And finally, on the technical side, in order to maintain the project, we want to make sure that the technical know-how exists in the community to keep the project operating into the future. So if we take each of these 4 factors into account when we design a project, we have a better chance of the project meeting the needs of the community and being sustainable into the future. Our goal is to make sure that we've done what we can to design a project for our partner communities now and into the long term. So sustainability within EWB USA is the capacity for the project to endure. This definition emphasizes the need for our partner communities to have the capacity to sustain the project into the future in the context of development work. So when looking at your assessment and your project process, you should look at whether the likelihood of the project still meeting the needs of the community in 10 years, in 20 years, and even in 30 years and beyond. Okay, so the objectives of the assessment trip. It will take time to understand the local history relating to the project, and there are subtleties in the community dynamic that we cannot see. So take the time to understand the community structure, inter-community relationships, and existing committees and leadership, as well as the technical capacity of the community. Consider then what is the best way to get to know them. So, for example, do they respond more to an open group setting or one-on-one in a household setting? Is it important to plan a social activity to break the ice with them, or is it culturally appropriate to just right off the bat start talking about technical issues? And pay attention to their culture. Is it, are they direct or indirect? How do you ask for something? Do you straight out ask for it, or do you start off with some small talk? These subtleties in cultural context can really help your team gain more insight into a community just by, even if it's asking the same question, asking it in a way that is more accepted in the local context. So it's really important to not make assumptions. So not to make assumptions about their priority needs. For example, if you're looking at a water project, it would be easy, and the existing situation, the women in the community are taking time to walk 2 miles away to gather water and bring it back. And you might assume that, of course, the women aren't going to want to spend that time gathering the water. But maybe in reality, the women highly value that time, that communal time spent with others in their community as they walk to that communal water collection point. So if that's the case, you would take that into consideration, and maybe instead of doing taps at each individual house, have community taps, so that the women can still spend that time, that communal time that they value, but they don't have to walk such a great distance. The other thing is to not make assumptions about their resources. So it's it's easy to assume that a group cannot afford anything. So, I've heard people call our partner communities the poorest of the poor. But in reality, they, have the funds to make decisions, maybe to purchase something at the market instead of growing it in their own garden, or buy a bottle of Coke. So really, it's important to focus on their priorities. So how they use their resources and how they use them on things that are a high priority to them. Working with partners, make sure that you are patient in your trip planning and dedicate a substantial amount of time to acquaint yourself with the community members. So it's important to allow some unstructured time to start getting to know your community partners. We don't have the local history related to the project, and we can't see the subtleties that in the community dynamic, and we don't have the expertise to engage in true community development. However, we have design and construction expertise, and that's our role. So in that role, we need to gather all applicable data to bring the right people on board to ensure the project success. That includes getting to know the client and assessing their technical capacity to meet the project, to maintain the project, and their capacity to organize the appropriate leadership and skilled workers to sustain the project that is implemented. Okay, so there's a lot of information out on the internet, and when you're preparing for your trip, as important as it is to prepare and look at the information that's available, you really have to be conscious to not rely too heavily on that trip preparation based off of similar situations, or even in neighboring, a situation that you read about in a neighboring country. Really, you want to prepare yourself to be open-minded, and if you start closing down your perspective based off of this second-hand information, you might set yourself up to miss key data while you're in the field. So when looking at existing conditions on site, that really requires a lot of patience and a lot of open-mindedness. So don't arrive with a list of data you need to collect without being open-minded to additional input for your project based on your observations and your interactions. So with that in mind, just make sure that your team talks to multiple people about the need that's going to be addressed by the project, and really ask, do all the people identify this as a priority, or is it a certain group? Make time in your schedule to seek out similar projects and experts who work on them in nearby communities and even regional centers or the capital. So this really can help you find what the typical success and failure factors are of this type of project that you're about to work on. And then look at how the community currently meets the need that's been identified. It's never the case that if there's a broken water system that the community just doesn't have access to water. So they're going somewhere. So where do they go? Are they satisfied with that solution? If they aren't, why not? If they're not satisfied because it's too costly, then implementing another system that would cost them more money or the same amount of money might not be the best solution. Include plans to document your observations in the community, not just technical data. So Does it make sense that they want it, that a community requested water treatment when they actually have, water treatment available through the municipality once a month? So really just start seeking out pieces to the whole puzzle so you can get a clear picture of the full situation. Try to assess how people spend their income. Now, that would include identifying their priority expenses without judgment. So this data you'll need to know in order to see what's feasible to expect the community to pay for ongoing maintenance and operations. And finally, are there cultural biases towards one system or another? And will you be proposing something that will create a negative cultural dynamic? In addition to asking this question, observe the conditions around you and discuss with your local partners what you observe. So an example of that would be, I worked in a community that they were cooking on open fires inside their homes. And, there was propane available locally. But they, when you actually started asking them, the reason that they didn't really want propane to replace their wood-burning open fires was because they thought that the food tasted, worse, or it altered the flavor of their food if they cooked it on propane versus their open fires. So something like that, where from a technical standpoint, propane would be better for their health, it's locally available, everything looks good, but when you actually start listening to what the community is saying, maybe it's not something that they would be willing to adapt because they don't feel like it can cook their local food to the same flavor that they're used to. Okay, so keep in mind that all of your projects must, all the materials for your projects must come from the community or the nearby regional market. So from EWB USA, you wouldn't be approved to bring anything for your implementation from the US. And your assessment trip is really the opportunity to identify what's available locally as you move further into the design phases. So the other thing is, if your community members can't easily find the materials you're looking for, then the design can't incorporate those materials. So it's really about making sure that the community has access to those materials after you leave, in case the system breaks or they need to purchase materials for repair. So in order to do that, it's important to visit the local hardware store and analyze what's available. And also compare that to what you're familiar with in the States. So, and keep that in mind when moving into the design phase. So an example of this on a project that I worked on, we designed a water system and we used the schedule PVC based off of what you can find easily in the US, and the piping that was available locally was actually based off of different specifications, and they weren't hugely different, but it was enough that we had to reassess our calculations to make sure that the pressure that we were expecting in the pipes would, the pipe material that was available locally would withstand that pressure. So by upfront looking at not just what's available generally, but also the details and and the strengths of the materials that are available and how that's going to affect your design calculations. When you're in the hardware store, ask permission to take pictures of the materials. Also talk with local contractors and municipalities about trusted vendors. Are there any go-to suppliers that you can rely on through your partners? Learn about traditional practices with different materials to inform the design and the schedule. For example, how do they mix concrete? How do they work with wood? Is it more dense than you're used to? How long does it take to produce enough blocks for construction? Another good idea is, if possible, to bring back materials for testing. So if you're working with hand-mixed concrete, if you could take some back and test the strength of that concrete, so then you can design to that strength. Another example, a chapter found steel that was marked at 60 KSI, and when they brought it home and tested it, it actually failed at 40 KSI. So knowing the strength of your materials that you're working with really can help you, reduce the uncertainty in your design. And if you know those strengths, you can, design based off of that information. Otherwise, you'd have to add some additional safety factor of safety based off of the uncertainty, and that can actually add cost to your project. Enlist your community counterparts and project partners to negotiate costs for materials. This is really important because they're always going to get a better deal and a more accurate price on the material. So it's important to rely on them to negotiate that cost. And finally, consider that the project buyer is the community and it's not you. So if they can't afford to replace the system if it fails, then the design isn't sustainable. Okay, so for educational materials, EWB USA is not alone the community or development organization, but with our project partners, we need to ensure that the project includes the appropriate educational and training activities. The training sessions should be aimed at building capacity of groups such as the leadership committee, operation and maintenance staff, and individual households. Examples of these materials can be operation and maintenance training, end user training, or hygiene training as it relates to the implemented infrastructure. Activities should be done by or in partnership with the local NGO, community-based organization, local teachers, water authority, etc. So the EWB team should not be doing training in a vacuum. Locals need to review the content to make sure the images and translations make sense. Ideally, a train-the-trainer approach should be used for local trainers to reinforce the concepts. On an assessment trip, you need to assess if the intended audience you're training, you're creating these materials for, if they're literate, and if so, are they reading and writing in a local language? And if that's the case, would you need to translate those materials? If they're not literate, then would pictures or photos be better? If you're planning to draw images for an operation and maintenance manual, it's important that your community partners and the community or key members of the community review the materials to make sure that you're demonstrating what you're trying to. Okay, so this example, a chapter created this poster, and they actually made significant revisions based off of their community partners' feedback. So looking at this, the community partners said that that the rats in the picture, the rats looking like a patient and a doctor, that actually the community would perceive doctors as rats. So, and then also over here, that they would have no understanding of a flying dollar bill. So these were things that you know, that had to be revised, because in their current state, they wouldn't be understood the way that the team was hoping. Another example, in El Salvador, they use X through a photo when voting, and that actually means that's the person they want to vote for. So where typically in the U.S. we would draw an X through like an undesirable option. So that's an example of where it would be a completely different understanding based off of their cultural perspective. An example of getting locals to review the content. An EWB-US team had an NGO contact review the educational materials survey. The NGO contact didn't live in the specific community they were working in, but in the region. So she did have a lot of great feedback, and but she didn't know one key point. So in the surveys, this was a latrine project, and in the surveys they had a lot of references to the word toilet, the regional word for toilet. But what they didn't know is that the community actually had their own word for toilet. So they didn't understand what they were asking when conducting the survey. So looking at this shows what they came up with after all of the feedback. So comparing these original photos or images to these revisions. So you can really see how that community feedback helped inform this process. Okay, so the community's capacity to plan for future operation and maintenance of the project is one of the most important aspects of assessing if the project can be sustained. If they cannot or will not pay for it, it simply will not last. So these conversations must be had with the help of your local partner. It is inappropriate in every culture that I know to have discussions with strangers about their household income and their utility bills. But there is a unique way to talk about money in each community, and the assessment trip allows you to continue to develop your relationship and identify how the best way to communicate the short and long-term financial viability of the community leadership and members at large. So EWB USA as an organization requires a minimum of 5% cash contribution towards the capital cost of the project. So this wouldn't include labor, food, lodging, transportation, and logistics, because those really aren't enough. None of these will pay the bills for a replacement part or a maintenance contract if something fails in the system in the future. If the community is only contributing a percentage of the project, you might consider having them contribute, purchase a particular part of the system and something that might fail. So if you are working on a water system and there's a valve that, based off of the information you've gained looking at similar systems, that piece is first of all, maybe a slightly higher price and very likely to fail, or more likely to fail than another part, then you might ask the community to purchase that part and have that as their contribution. And really the reason for that is that they'll know, they'll know where to purchase that part in the future and how much it costs. So ask them to present you how they will fund maintenance, including telling you what they can and are willing to pay on a long-term system cost. Because really that is a limiting factor and a parameter for your design. So if they're only going to pay 50 cents per month per family, and you design a system that requires $2 per month per family, then that system really isn't going to be able to be maintained just because it's and it has a low chance for success because they're not going to be able to maintain it based off of the amount that the community contributes. And finally, remember that this is their project. So if they want it, they reached out to our organization for assistance. And if you're in a position of having to convince the community to contribute to it, you should reconsider whether it's you or the community that is driving the project forward. And it really should always be the community. Okay, so looking at our another thing you want to do on a first assessment trip is we now have standard partnership documents. So there's the 902, which is the project partnership agreement, and that agreement is a three-way partnership between the community, the local NGO, and your chapter. And this agreement really should be negotiated and signed at the end of the first assessment trip of the program. And the reason for this is it establishes the expectations for working with our organization and establishes the expectations between your chapter, the local community, and the NGO partner that you're working with. So be honest and clear as to why this agreement is needed, since the community will be skeptical after years of well-intentioned organizations coming into the community but doing nothing. So all parties should have an understanding of this partnership, that this partnership will be documented, and consider this initial discussion a way of setting expectations about the coming years. So make sure that your team's discussing this in an appropriate way and documenting it in an appropriate way based off of the local context as well. So, and this agreement, it's not going to mean much if you're drafting it in a vacuum without their input. So make it a discussion and make sure that it's something that all parties are a part of. So when you move into the design phase, you'll have an additional agreement, which will be the implementation agreement. That's the 903. There's a template on the website. And that agreement, that's kind of later on after the partnership agreement as you're moving towards implementation. And that really puts the expectations for a particular implementation in writing. And it makes sure that the project is clearly described, that it clearly outlines the time and resource expectation. So for example, in that agreement you might put that the community is going to contribute 10 people for 5 days to dig a 100-meter pipe trench. So really making sure that the expectations are specific for the construction to move forward. And also the cost expectations of each party. So the community might cover 5 to 10% of the total project cost, And the other thing about this agreement is to be realistic, especially about timelines, because you know, it's easy to be overly optimistic on what you can get done in a certain time, but there's travel delays and fundraising and a lot of things that go into how quickly a project moves. So it's just important to be realistic when making, and realistic and really conservative when making promises on a timeline. Okay, so these are the questions that you could ask in order to just kind of look at, to reassess whether you're still on the right path to sustainability. So the project process is not intended to be linear. So you should really be revisiting your data often and assessing the sustainability throughout the process of the project. And really be honest with yourselves as you consider who is maintaining the drive for the project to continue. And if it's your team and not the community, you should really regroup and make sure that the community is on board with the project plans. Because if that's the case, there's really no way that the project will be sustained at a local level. So, you know, the questions that you would ask yourself would be, are you working through local partners? Are you assuming the role of developing the community? Have you spoken to all applicable local partners? Have you reached out to other EWB USC teams in the country? Have you visited other similar projects in the region? Have you experimented with your project technology? So, or are you experimenting with project technology? So the reason for that question is, you know, as an organization, we're looking to implement technologies that are known and sustainable and locally appropriate. So we shouldn't be in a situation where we're experimenting with a new technology and kind of using the community as a guinea pig. We want to implement technology that's known and something that's going to work, because these are you know, we're meeting needs of people, real people who you know, need to continue to live with whatever system we've implemented. So we should really never be in a case where we're experimenting with new technology. Okay, so you should ask, who's leading the project? Is it you or the community? Who do you think knows more about the project you are working on? So these are just some questions to kind of assess whether you're still on the right track. Okay, so really the next steps, to talk about the next steps after the assessment phase. So sustainability should be your focus throughout the project, not just at the beginning when you're assessing and then at the end when your work is complete. A lot of things can change during design development, and everything we've discussed should be revisited throughout your design effort to make sure that your design is still relevant and still sustainable. So with that in mind, you really have to keep in touch with the community remotely. You can't just rely on your partners to make sure that you're getting the information. And you also should have multiple community representatives that you're talking to. Hold on a second. Okay, so some examples of things that can change in the community. New leaders can be elected, and you know, the new leaders might not have any attachment to this project. Community resources can be reallocated, and priorities can shift. Local experts can move out of the community. Costs of materials can skyrocket. So if suddenly the part, a component of the system is double the price, then you'd have to reassess that operation and maintenance costs and how much the community can raise. And then also your local partner or local NGO can move on. On the other side, things can change in your team as well. So for example, if the country becomes unsafe to travel in, then maybe your team is at the point where they can implement a project, but they just can't travel because of security concerns in the country. Leadership can change, which causes a loss of continuity, and also fundraising can dry up. So these are really pretty common challenges that teams face through their design phases, and any one of these things can make your assessment data obsolete. So you need to start those conversations again and again and communicate with the community and stay in touch with them and continue to enhance your design with their input. Remember that you cannot have a sustainable project without the community, and consistent communication is not only a safeguard against problems arising unexpectedly, but will ensure that the community is driving the project. To do so, they have to be in the loop throughout your design development and given the opportunity to provide input. So really, as your team completes each round of project documentation and submits those reports to our office, you should make sure to plan to continually update your data on sustainability in each report. So these reports really serve as documentation for your team moving into the future. So sometimes we'll see just a copy and paste from one report to the next, but really it's important to make sure that the most updated information about sustainability is included in each set of reports so that can continue to document that throughout the life of the project. Okay, so that's all I had to talk about today. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and then open it up for questions from you guys.